At 10:22 hours on June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey pushed his SBD-3 Dauntless into a 70-degree dive from 14,500 feet, watching the Japanese carrier Kaga grow larger in his bomb sight. He had been airborne for 3 hours, searching for the Japanese fleet with fuel running critically low. His 33 dive bombers had been minutes from turning back when he spotted destroyer Wake pointing northeast. Following that wake had led him to 4 Japanese carriers, their decks crowded with aircraft being fueled and armed. The carriers were completely vulnerable. No combat air patrol above them, because Japanese fighters were at low altitude, having just finished slaughtering American torpedo bombers. No anti-aircraft fire yet, because Japanese gunners were watching the torpedo attacks and hadn't seen McCluskey's dive bombers at 14,500 feet. The entire Japanese carrier force was exposed, undefended, and about to be destroyed. McCluskey's bomb sight tracked Kaga's flight deck as altitude unwound 12,000 feet, 10,000 feet, 8,000 feet. Airspeed built past 250 knots. The SBD shuddered in the slipstream but remained stable, rock-solid in the dive. At 2,500 feet, McCluskey pulled the bomb release. A 1,000-pound bomb dropped away. He pulled back hard on the stick, felt the G-forces compress him into the seat, and rolled right to see where his bomb hit. The 1,000-pound bomb struck Kaga's flight deck aft of the island, penetrating into the hangar deck before exploding among aircraft being fueled. The explosion ignited aviation gasoline, starting a massive fire. 2 more bombs hit Kaga in the next 30 seconds as McCluskey's squadron continued their attacks. Behind them, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's squadron was attacking carrier Soryu. Akagi was being hit simultaneously by another group. In 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers were burning. By 10:30 hours, all 3 would be doomed. At 14:45 hours that afternoon, a 4th carrier Hiryu would be destroyed by dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown. 4 Japanese fleet carriers sunk in one day. Japan's strategic offensive capability destroyed in 6 hours. The tide of the Pacific War reversed by SBD Dauntless dive bombers that had been considered obsolete when the war began. This was the moment that proved the Dauntless was the most important American aircraft of 1942. The story of the SBD began with a designer who understood that precision bombing required aircraft that could dive vertically onto targets, that level bombing from altitude wasted bombs, and that dive bombing was the only way to guarantee hits on maneuvering ships. Ed Heinemann joined Northrop Aircraft Corporation as chief engineer in 1936 at age 27. His assignment was designing a carrier-based dive bomber to replace the biplane dive bombers then equipping Navy squadrons. The specification called for 2-seat configuration single-engine bomb load of 1,000 pounds and ability to dive vertically onto targets. Heinemann's design, designated BT-1, first flew in August 1935. The aircraft showed promise but had stability problems in steep dives. Heinemann redesigned the wing, enlarging it and adding perforated dive brakes that deployed from the trailing edge. The dive brakes slowed the aircraft in steep dives, allowing pilots to maintain control while diving vertically. Northrop was acquired by Douglas Aircraft in 1937. The BT-2, an improved version with more powerful engine and better dive characteristics, was redesignated SBD-1, where S indicated Scout, B indicated Bomber, and D indicated Douglas manufacturer. The first production SBD-1 flew on May 1, 1940. The SBD-3, which would fight at Midway, was 33 feet long with a 41-foot, 6-inch wingspan. Empty weight was 404 pounds. Maximum loaded weight was 10,400 pounds. A single-right R-1820-52 Cyclone 9-cylinder radial engine producing 1,000 horsepower drove a 3-blade constant-speed propeller. The aircraft's performance was unimpressive by fighter standards. Maximum speed was 255 miles per hour at 14,000 feet. Cruising speed was 152 miles per hour. Service ceiling was 25 530 feet. Range was 115 miles with maximum fuel, or 456 miles with a 1,000-pound bomb load. Rate of climb was 190 feet per minute. These numbers made the SBD slower than most fighters, unable to outrun or outclimb opponents. But the SBD excelled at its designed mission dive bombing. The aircraft could roll into a dive from any altitude, reach terminal velocity of 276 miles per hour in vertical descent, maintain stable flight throughout the dive, and pull out at low altitude without structural failure. Dive brakes deployed hydraulically, extending from the trailing edge of each wing to slow the aircraft and prevent excessive speed buildup. The bomb sight was a simple telescopic sight mounted between the pilot's legs, pointing through a hole in the cockpit floor. In a dive, the pilot aimed the entire aircraft at the target using the bomb sight to judge when to release the bomb. The technique required practice and nerve. Pilots had to hold the dive until 2,500 feet or lower, ensuring the bomb didn't have time to drift off target. Pulling out too early meant missing. Pulling out too late meant crashing. Bomb load was one 1,000-pound bomb mounted on a crutch beneath the fuselage. The crutch swung the bomb forward during release so it cleared the propeller arc. Additionally, the SBD could carry two 250-pound or 100-pound bombs on wing racks. Maximum ordnance load was 2,250 pounds, but this severely degraded performance. Standard load was one 1,000-pound bomb centerline. Defensive armament consisted of two fixed forward-firing 50-caliber machine guns mounted in the engine, cowling synchronized to fire through the propeller. The rear gunner manned twin 30-caliber machine guns on a flexible mount. The rear guns provided minimal defense against attacking fighters but were better than nothing. The two-man crew consisted of pilot and rear seat gunner, jitter, radio man. The pilot flew the aircraft, navigated, and conducted attacks. The rear gunner operated the radio, navigated using backup methods, and manned the defensive guns. Communication between crew members was via intercom, essential during combat when coordination determined survival. Crew members developed intense bonds. They flew together for months or years, trained together, fought together, and depended on each other for survival. When one crew member was lost, the survivor often requested assignment to non-flying duties because flying with someone new felt like betrayal. The relationship between pilot and gunner was unique in military aviation, combining the intimacy of a two-man team with the shared danger of combat. By December 1941, the SBD equipped every Navy and Marine Corps dive bomber squadron. Enterprise, Lexington, Yorktown, Saratoga, Wasp, and Hornet all operated SBD squadrons. Marine squadrons at Midway, Wake, and other Pacific bases flew SBDs. The aircraft was ubiquitous, the standard dive bomber of the fleet. When Pearl Harbor was attacked on December 7, 1941, Enterprise was returning from delivering Marine fighters to Wake Island. Her SBD squadrons were airborne, conducting search patterns when Japanese aircraft struck Pearl Harbor. Several SBDs arrived over Oahu during the attack and were engaged by Japanese fighters. Some were shot down by friendly anti-aircraft fire from panicked gunners who fired at anything flying. The early months of the Pacific War demonstrated the SBD's capabilities and limitations. During the Marshall Gilbert raids in February 1942, SBDs sank several Japanese ships in harbor attacks. During the Doolittle raid support operations in April 1942, SBDs provided combat air patrol for the Carrier Task Force. At the Battle of Coral Sea on May 7–8, 1942, SBDs sank the Japanese light carrier Shoho and damaged fleet carrier Shokaku. But Coral Sea also revealed the SBD's vulnerability. Japanese fighters shot down several SBDs during attacks. The slow speed made them easy targets for Zeros. The light defensive armament couldn't prevent determined fighter attacks. Crews learned that diving through anti-aircraft fire required nerve because they had to hold the dive despite seeing flak bursts ahead. The Battle of Midway would prove whether the SBD could survive against first-line Japanese forces. Admiral Chester Nimitz, commanding the Pacific Fleet, knew Japanese carriers were approaching Midway Island. Intelligence had broken Japanese codes and provided warning. Nimitz positioned his three available carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, northeast of Midway, planning to ambush the Japanese carrier fleet. The Japanese force consisted of 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, plus 2 battleships, 3 cruisers, and 12 destroyers. The carriers embarked 248 aircraft, including 72 fighters, 81 dive bombers, and 95 torpedo bombers. This was the same force that had attacked Pearl Harbor veterans with 6 months of combat experience. The American force included Enterprise with 79 aircraft, Hornet with 79 aircraft, and Yorktown with 76 aircraft. Total strength was 234 aircraft, including 112 SBD Dauntless dive bombers, 42 TBD Devastator torpedo bombers, and 80 fighters. The American aircraft were newer and less experienced. Many pilots had never dropped a bomb in combat. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Japanese carriers launched strikes against Midway Island at 30 hours. The 108 aircraft bombed Midway's facilities while American defenders launched everything available to counterattack. B-17s, B-26, Marine fighters and Marine SBDs all attacked the Japanese fleet. None achieved meaningful results. The Japanese shot down most attackers and continued operations. At 700 hours, American carrier commanders received reports of the Japanese fleet's position 200 miles southwest. All three carriers prepared to launch strikes immediately. The decision was critical because Japanese scouts might locate American carriers at any moment. Striking first could decide the battle. Enterprise and Hornet launched between 700 and 800 hours. Yorktown launched at 830 hours. The strike forces totaled 156 aircraft, 54 SBD dive bombers, 42 TBD torpedo bombers, and 60 fighters. But coordination broke down immediately. The slow torpedo bombers flew at different altitudes and speeds than the faster dive bombers. Fighter escorts lost contact with their bomber groups. The strike force fragmented into separate groups approaching the Japanese fleet independently. This fragmentation proved catastrophic for the torpedo bombers and fortuitous for the dive bombers. At 9:30 hours, Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8 found the Japanese carriers and attacked without fighter escort. All 15 TBD Devastators were shot down by Japanese fighters and anti-aircraft fire. Not one torpedo hit. Every aircrew member except Ensign George Gay was killed. Enterprise's Torpedo Squadron 6 attacked at 9:40 hours. 10 of 14 aircraft were shot down, no hits. Yorktown's Torpedo Squadron 3 attacked at 1,000 hours. 10 of 12 aircraft were shot down, no hits. In 30 minutes, the Japanese destroyed 35 of 42 American torpedo bombers, killing 55 of 84 aircrew. The attacks achieved nothing except pulling Japanese fighters down to low altitude where they chased the last torpedo bombers. But those attacks set up what happened next. At 10:20 hours, while Japanese fighters were at sea level chasing the final torpedo bombers, while Japanese carriers were recovering aircraft and rearming others, while every Japanese sailor was watching the torpedo attacks, three groups of American dive bombers arrived overhead at 14,500 feet. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey's 33 SBDs from Enterprise had been searching southwest of the expected Japanese position for over an hour. Fuel was critically low. Many pilots were below reserve levels and would have to ditch if they didn't turn back immediately. McCluskey decided to search northeast following a hunch that the Japanese had changed course. At 1005 hours, McCluskey spotted destroyer Wake pointing northeast. He followed the wake and at 10:20 hours saw the Japanese carrier force. 4 carriers in a box formation, widely spaced decks crowded with aircraft. The carriers were completely vulnerable. Japanese fighters were at low altitude. Anti-aircraft guns were not yet firing. McCluskey ordered immediate attack. His squadrons split. Bombing Squadron 6 with 25 SBDs would attack the nearest carrier, Kaga. Scouting Squadron 6 with 8 SBDs would attack Akagi. Behind them, Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie's 17 SBDs from Yorktown were attacking Soryu. All 3 attacks would hit simultaneously. McCluskey dove on Kaga at 10:22 hours. His 1,000-pound bomb hit aft of the island, penetrating the flight deck and exploding in the hangar among fueled aircraft. Lieutenant Richard Best dove on Akagi, his bomb hitting forward of the island and causing similar devastation. Leslie attacked Soryu, scoring 3 direct hits in quick succession. The results were catastrophic for Japan. All 3 carriers were set ablaze within 5 minutes. Fires spread rapidly among aircraft being fueled and armed on the hangar decks. Bombs and torpedoes, stacked for loading, began exploding as fires reached them. Damage control parties fought fires, but were overwhelmed. Within 20 minutes, all three carriers were burning out of control. Kaga burned through the morning. Explosions continued as fires reached magazines and fuel tanks. At 19:25 hours, Kaga sank. Of 1,700 crew, 800 died. Akagi burned all day. At 0500 hours on June 5th, Japanese destroyers scuttled her with torpedoes. Of 2,000 crew, 267 died. Soryu burned until 1913 hours when she sank. Of 100 crew, 718 died. The fourth carrier, Hiryu, was undamaged at 10:30 hours because she had been steaming separately. Her aircraft had not yet launched. At 1100 hours, Hiryu launched strikes against Yorktown, hitting her with bombs and torpedoes. Yorktown was severely damaged and eventually sank on June 7th. But at 1445 hours, dive bombers from Enterprise and the crippled Yorktown found Hiryu. 24 SBDs attacked, scoring 4 hits that set Hiryu ablaze. The fires burned through the night. At 0510 hours on June 5th, Japanese destroyers scuttled Hiryu. Of 1,500 crew, 392 died. In one day, 4 Japanese fleet carriers were destroyed. Japan's strategic striking power was shattered. The loss could not be replaced quickly. Japanese industry lacked capacity to build fleet carriers at the rate America was building them. The trained aircrew who died at Midway, over 2,000 pilots, aircrew, and deck personnel, were irreplaceable. The Battle of Midway reversed the strategic balance in the Pacific. Before Midway, Japan was advancing. After Midway, Japan was defending. The initiative passed to America and never returned to Japan. Every subsequent battle in the Pacific was fought to reclaim territory Japan had conquered. Japan never again attempted strategic offensive operations. The SBD Dauntless achieved this reversal. In 5 minutes of diving attacks from 10:22 to 10:27 hours on June 4, 1942, SBDs destroyed 3 carriers. 6 hours later, they destroyed a 4th. No other aircraft in World War II accomplished as much in a single day. No other aircraft changed the strategic situation so dramatically in one battle. But the SBD's contribution to victory extended far beyond Midway. From Pearl Harbor through the end of the war, SBDs flew more combat sorties than any other American carrier aircraft. They sank more Japanese shipping than any other aircraft type. They provided more close air support for ground forces than any other Navy aircraft. They were the primary strike aircraft of the fleet from 1941 through mid-1944. During the Guadalcanal campaign from August 1942 through February 1943, SBDs operated from both carriers and Henderson Field, attacking Japanese ships attempting to reinforce or evacuate troops. SBDs sank the carrier Ryujo on August 24th. They damaged the carrier Shokaku on October 26. They sank numerous cruisers, destroyers, and transports throughout the campaign. In the Battle of the Eastern Solomons on August 24, 1942, SBDs from Enterprise and Saratoga attacked the Japanese carrier fleet. They sank Ryujo and damaged seaplane carrier Chaitos. During the Battle of Santa Cruz on October 26, 1942, SBDs damaged carriers Shokaku and Zuiho, forcing both out of action for months. The pattern was consistent. Whenever carriers clashed, SBDs inflicted the critical damage. The aircraft's greatest strength was accuracy. A well-trained SBD pilot could put a 1,000-pound bomb within 25 feet of aim point from 10,000 feet altitude. That accuracy made the SBD deadly against ships which could not evade a bomb released from 2,500 feet. Surface ships could maneuver against level bombers dropping from 15,000 feet, but they couldn't maneuver fast enough to avoid dive bombing. The SBD's second strength was reliability. The Wright Cyclone engine ran for hundreds of hours between overhauls. Hydraulic systems were simple and robust. Landing gear was strong enough to withstand carrier landings in rough seas. Maintenance requirements were minimal compared to fighters. Dive bomber squadrons maintained higher readiness rates than fighter squadrons because their aircraft were more reliable. The third strength was survivability. The SBD was not armored like a fighter, but its structure was strong enough to absorb considerable battle damage and continue flying. Pilots brought SBDs back to carriers with holes in wings, damaged engines, shot-away control surfaces, and wounded crew members. The aircraft kept flying when, by all logic, it should have crashed. This survivability came from careful design. Critical systems were redundant or protected. Fuel tanks were self-sealing. The pilot sat behind armor plate. The structure was overbuilt to withstand dive pull-out loads, which meant it could also withstand battle damage. Many SBDs returned from missions with damage that would have destroyed lighter aircraft. But the SBD was not invincible. Japanese fighters shot down hundreds during the war. Anti-aircraft fire destroyed dozens during low-level attacks. Operational accidents killed crews during training and combat operations. The slow speed meant that any fighter that caught an SBD could shoot it down unless the SBD crew spotted the fighter early and took evasive action. Crew training emphasized lookout procedures. Both pilot and gunner constantly scanned the sky for fighters. If fighters were spotted early, the SBD could dive away using its excellent dive speed to escape. But if fighters closed undetected, the SBD's only defense was the twin 30-caliber guns in the rear seat, inadequate against determined attack. The rear gunners deserve recognition. They flew every mission knowing their primary job was watching for fighters that would try to kill them. They manned defensive guns that could not reliably stop attacking fighters. They had no control over the aircraft and had to trust their pilot completely. Many rear gunners died shooting at fighters that killed them seconds later. But many rear gunners also saved their pilots. Warnings of attacking fighters allowed pilots to take evasive action. Defensive fire forced attacking fighters to break off or alter their attacks. Some rear gunners shot down Japanese fighters, though claims were often disputed because multiple aircraft engaged the same fighter. The rear gunner position required courage equal to the pilot's, but received less recognition. By mid-1944, the SBD was being replaced by the SB-2C Helldiver, a larger dive bomber with better performance. The transition was controversial. Many pilots preferred the SBD's handling characteristics and reliability over the Helldiver's superior performance. The SB-2C was faster and carried heavier bomb loads, but it was also less stable in dives, more difficult to land on carriers, and less reliable. The last major SBD combat operations occurred during the Philippine campaign in late 1944. After that, most carrier squadrons had transitioned to Helldivers. But Marine SBD squadrons continued operations from land bases throughout 1944 and into 1945, providing close air support for ground forces. The last combat mission by an SBD was flown in June 1945. Total SBD production reached 536 aircraft, delivered between 1940 and 1944. Of these, approximately 1,400 were lost in combat, 200 in operational accidents, and the remainder scrapped or retired after the war. The combat loss rate was approximately 24% lower than torpedo bombers but higher than fighters. But SBDs destroyed enemy assets worth far more than their own losses. The economic calculation of aerial warfare is brutal but relevant. Each SBD cost approximately $60,000 to build, including engine and equipment. Each Japanese carrier cost $60 million to build. At Midway, 54 SBDs costing $3.2 million total destroyed 4 carriers worth $240 million. The return on investment was 7,500%. No other weapon system in history has achieved comparable results. But reducing Midway to economics ignores the human element. The pilots who dove on Kaga Akagi Soryu and Hiryu knew they were attacking the most powerful naval force in the Pacific. They knew Japanese fighters could intercept them. They knew anti-aircraft fire could destroy them. They dove anyway because that was their mission. Wade McCluskey dove on Kaga with fuel gauges reading near empty. If he survived the attack, he would have barely enough fuel to return to Enterprise. If he had to divert or extend his flight, he would ditch in the ocean. He dove anyway. Maxwell Leslie dove on Soryu after his bomb had released accidentally during flight to the target. He had no bomb, but led his squadron in the attack anyway, drawing anti-aircraft fire while his pilots bombed. Lieutenant Richard Best attacked Akagi despite knowing that only 3 SBDs remained in his division. The other aircraft in his squadron were attacking Kaga under McCluskey's direction due to communication confusion. Best had to decide in seconds whether to join the Kaga attack or proceed to Akagi alone. He chose Akagi, leading 2 other pilots in an attack that destroyed Japan's flagship carrier. These decisions made in seconds under extreme stress determined the battle's outcome. If McCluskey had turned back before finding the Japanese fleet, the carriers might have escaped. If Leslie had not led his squadron despite having no bomb, Soryu might have survived. If Best had not attacked Akagi with only 3 aircraft, she might have survived. Each decision made independently by individual pilots was critical. That is the nature of dive bombing. Each pilot was alone in his dive, alone with his bomb sight, alone with the decision of when to release. No one could help. No one could verify the sight picture or calculate the lead or judge the pullout point. The pilot had to do everything perfectly while aircraft shuddered in the slipstream, while flak burst around him, while the target grew larger at a closing speed of 300 miles per hour. The training to make those decisions under pressure took months. New pilots practiced dive bombing on target sleds towed in coastal waters. They dove from 10,000 feet, 8,000 feet, 6,000 feet, learning how altitude affected the dive angle and bomb trajectory. They learned to judge when to release by sight picture alone, without relying on instruments. They practiced until the technique became muscle memory. Even with training, the first combat dive was terrifying. Pilots described it as the longest and shortest minute of their lives. The dive seemed to last forever as altitude unwound and the target grew larger. But it also seemed instantaneous, a blur of motion and noise and G-forces that ended with pullout and the desperate hope that your bomb had hit. The rear gunners experienced different terror. They watched the dive backwards, seeing the ocean rise toward them, feeling the aircraft shudder and shake, listening to the wind scream past the open cockpit. They could do nothing except hold on and pray. Some gunners got sick from the negative G-forces of dive entry. Some panicked and had to be replaced. Most learned to cope through repetition and trust in their pilot. After the war, many SBD pilots said the aircraft was their favorite. They remembered its solid feel in a dive, its reliability, its ability to bring them home damaged. They remembered their rear gunners who had watched for fighters on 100 missions. They remembered the satisfaction of seeing their bombs hit targets, knowing they had contributed to victory. They stayed in contact with squadron mates for decades, attending reunions and sharing stories. The SBD veterans formed associations that maintained the aircraft's memory. The Battle of Midway Roundtable brought together veterans from all sides to discuss what happened. The SBD Dauntless Pilots Association preserved records and artifacts. These organizations kept the story alive as the veteran generation aged and passed away. Today, only a handful of airworthy SBDs remain. Maintaining 80-year-old dive bombers requires specialized knowledge, expensive parts, and constant attention. But owners keep them flying because the SBD represents a critical moment in American history. The aircraft that won Midway, that reversed the Pacific War, that proved dive bombing was the most effective way to destroy ships, deserves to be remembered. The SBD Dauntless was not glamorous. It was slower than fighters, less sophisticated than heavy bombers, more vulnerable than anything with armor. But it was the right aircraft for its mission. It could dive vertically onto targets. It could deliver bombs accurately. It was reliable enough to operate from carriers for years, and it was available in quantity when America needed it most. That combination of characteristics possessed by no other aircraft in 1942 made the SBD the most important American aircraft of the war's early years. Not the P-51 Mustang, not the B-17 Flying Fortress, not the F-6F Hellcat. Those aircraft came later and contributed to ultimate victory. But in June 1942, when the Pacific War hung in balance, when losing carriers meant losing the initiative, the SBD Dauntless saved America's position in the Pacific. On that morning of June 4, 1942, when Wade McCluskey pushed over from 14,500 feet and dove on Kaga, when Maxwell Leslie led his squadron onto Soryu, when Richard Best attacked Akagi with 3 aircraft, they were proving what dive bombing could achieve. They were demonstrating that precision attack from aircraft could destroy the most powerful surface ships ever built. They were changing naval warfare forever. The Japanese carriers at Midway were protected by fighters' anti-aircraft guns and combat experience from 6 months of victory. They should have been nearly invulnerable. But 5 minutes of dive bombing destroyed 3 carriers. 6 hours later, a 4th carrier was destroyed. The SBD Dauntless had accomplished what battleships, cruisers, and submarines could not. It had sunk fleet carriers in open ocean under combat conditions. That achievement defined the SBD's legacy. Not just that it won Midway, though that alone justifies its place in history, but that it proved precision bombing from aircraft could destroy any surface target. That dive bombing was the decisive tactic against ships, that aircraft carriers were the dominant naval weapons of the modern era. The SBD didn't just win a battle, it validated an entire theory of naval warfare. That is why the SBD matters. That is why the aircraft and the men who flew it deserve to be remembered. They changed history in 5 minutes over the Pacific Ocean, proving that courage, skill, and the right aircraft at the right time could reverse the tide of war. That is the measure of greatness. That is the legacy of the Dauntless.